Dear participants, greetings everyone. Welcome to the Journalism Writers Foundation CSW 67 panel discussion, Violence Against Women Journalists Around the World. I'm Cemre Ulker, the UN representative of the JWF, an international civil society organization dedicated to the culture of peace, human rights, and sustainable development. JWF is also affiliated with the UN Department of Global Communications. UN advocacy for women's rights, working on innovative policy suggestions and civil society inputs to various UN agencies are among the priority areas of the Journalism Writers Foundation. We organize series of training sessions and empowerment programs for women's rights advocates and youth activists across the world to set a bridge to bring in their successful civil society contributions to different intergovernmental platforms. So this event is one of the other 12 panel discussions that we organize in partnership with 13 civil society organizations from USA, UK, Romania, Greece, Brazil, India, Germany, and Kyrgyzstan on a variety of topics to advance women's rights and work towards gender mainstreaming of the Sustainable Development Goals. So today we will be hosting notable journalists, credible media experts from different parts of the world covering various country-specific cases. Women are subject to intersectional violence on so many different grounds, but online attacks, defamation campaigns, physical, psychological violence, legal harassment, most importantly, continue to be increasingly reported as women journalists are on the front line documenting various atrocity crimes taking place across the globe. Women in media have an important role to disseminate critical information through a gender-sensitive lens and combat against the discriminatory media literacy. But even in the most dire settings, women journalists are being subject to harassment. A month ago, Turkey and Syria were hit by a series of devastating earthquakes, and the death toll, unfortunately, in Turkey passed over 45,000, leaving hundreds of thousands displaced and impacted. So even under these challenging atmospheres, Coalition Against Women Journalists reported that in February 2023, Turkey was at the top of the list with the alarming increase of violence against women journalists, covering the aftermath of the earthquakes, and many even faced criminal charges. We will shortly hear more from our expert speakers, but before that, we have a short introduction video for today, so let's watch that to continue the session.
During the 67th session of the UN Commission on the Status of Women, the Journalists and Writers Foundation is organizing a virtual parallel event on violence against women journalists around the world on March 9, 2023. With the rise of autocratic regimes, 2022 marked another milestone in deteriorating media independence and press freedom, while combating different forms of human rights violations, including physical attacks, harassment, arbitrary detentions, and defamation campaigns. Women journalists from different parts of the world will discuss the deteriorating status of press freedom and underlying gender-based challenges encountered by journalists, including gender-based violations faced by women journalists, the role and experiences of women journalists covering war crimes in Ukraine, best practices of women journalists to create global solidarity for women in Iran, forms of increasing violence against women journalists, cases from Brazil. Join us in this interactive event to support women journalists as a beacon of press freedom and human rights, and empower women in your life and everywhere.
Stephanie Fillion will be our moderator today. She's a New York-based reporter specializing in foreign affairs and human rights and the United Nations correspondent. She has a master's degree in journalism, politics, and global affairs from Columbia University, and a bachelor degree in political science from McGill University. In recent years, her wonderful UN coverage received 2 UN Correspondent Association Awards, as well as a Gracie Award from the Alliance for women in media. So we're honored to have this moderation, an award-winning with an award-winning moderator. For our audience, a small reminder, please ask your questions, comments in the QA box, either here in Zoom, but at the same time, we are live at the JWF's YouTube channel as well. So Stephanie will be going through all the comments and questions at the very last of the session. So I leave the platform to you, Stephanie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cemre, and thank you also to the Foundation for organizing this event. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone, or even good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to this all-women panel. As it was said, my name is Stephanie Fillion, and I'm talking to you live from New York City, and I'm a United Nations correspondent. But I started my career as a TV reporter in Vancouver, Canada. That was back in 2015, and back then I remember that there was a trend. The trend was to yell gender-related obscenities to women reporters when they were live on TV. So on a reporting trip to Whistler in Western Canada, it happened to me more than once. And for those who work as a TV reporter, you'll know that it's hard enough to think about all the details of a live hit on TV, whether it's thinking about the information that you have to convey, or also when you have a producer talking to you in your ears, or potential technical issues. So dealing with strangers yelling obscenities about, the female body definitely doesn't help with your line of work. And a few weeks after, I also remember that the same thing happened to me, but a colleague of mine was even kissed live on TV. And think about it. It was 2015 and it was in Canada. It was before the time that, journalists were considered fake news and journalists were considered the enemy of the people. And it was in a country where journalists are free and their work is relatively defended. And it was also before social media became a breeding ground for online violence. Now, this is one small example of a gender-based type of harassment women journalists have to deal with, but it's nothing compared to war zones in countries where people, especially women, have to fight for their basic rights. And as a UN correspondent, I cover these crises from New York City on a daily basis, and I depend on the important work of these reporters are with us today who are there on the ground, taking all kind of risks to bring us firsthand information. So without further ado, it's my pleasure and my honor to introduce you to our panelists today. So today we have with us Marina Diaz. Marina, you are a journalist working for the Washington Post in Brasilia, Brazil. You're also a former US correspondent for the Folha de São Paulo. And before that, you were also a national reporter at Folha, covering two Brazilian presidential campaigns and the 2016 presidential impeachment. In 2020, you were a nominee for the Prêmio Gabo de Periodismo for the Americans, a series of stories examining politics and social issues in the US Rust Belt during the Trump years. Marina, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Also with us today, Maria Yazdari, an Iranian American journalist and a television producer for Christian Broadcasting Network, where you have the opportunity to produce and anchor news shows. Myra, you have experience creating television programs for Farsi-speaking audiences, as well as reporting on Iran's most recent events. Through your social media platform, you connect directly with those whose voices have been silenced for so long, and your goal is to amplify the voice of the voiceless through your platforms. Myra, thank you so much as well for being with us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Also with us, Iryna Matviyishyn, a Ukrainian journalist and a producer with a human rights background, currently working as a video reporter at the Kyiv Independent. For 3 years, you work as a project coordinator, producer, analyst, and journalist of Ukraine World Media Project, focusing predominantly on the earlier Russian aggression against Ukraine and its consequences. And shortly before Russia's all-out war, you started working as a local producer and contributor for NPR, covering war in different regions. In early September 2022, you joined the Kyiv Independent as a video producer covering Russian war crimes and humanitarian issues, but her current work is mostly about analysis of Russian propaganda narratives and its implication. Iryna, you're talking to us from Lviv. Thank you so much for being with you.
Yes, thank you so much for presenting me, and I'm happy to be with you right now.
But first, we'll talk to Gulnoza Said, the Europe and Central Asia Program Coordinator at the Committee to Protect Journalists, or also called CPJ. Gulnoza, you're a journalist and a communication professional with over 15 years of experience in New York, Prague, Bratislava, and Tashkent. You have covered issues including politics, media, religion, and human rights with a focus on Central Asia, Russia, and Turkey. Gulnoza, just to begin, CPJ does very important work when it comes to gathering data and advocating for reporters around the world. So can you give us an overview of what it means to be a woman journalist today and what specific types of violations women reporters are facing right now?
Yes, thank you, Stephanie, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this event. I'm really honored to be speaking to you today and also to be on the same panel with these wonderful women. As to your question, Stephanie, we at the Committee to Protect Journalists have been documenting press freedom violations, including violations against women journalists. And just as you said, I want to speak about several forms of violations that are aimed at silencing women journalists. The ultimate form of censorship is murder. We continue working on achieving justice in cases of many women who have been killed in relation to their in relation and in retaliation for their reporting. We at CPJ started keeping a database of journalists and media workers killed on assignment in 1992. And since then, more than 2,000 journalists have been killed, and 106 of them are women. In 2022, 7 journalists were killed, women journalists, and 4 of those were covering the war in Ukraine. And other prominent killings of 2022 include that of Shirin Abu Akleh, who was killed, as I said, in retaliation for her work. And in most of those cases, when journalists were murdered in direct retaliation for their reporting, the full justice has not been achieved. At CPJ, we continue working on those cases, and I wanted to mention the murder of investigative journalist Daphne Caruana Galicia, who was murdered in Malta in 2017. The road to justice has been very difficult. Only with the pressure from the international community, from the EU institutions, the Maltese authorities have reluctantly been doing the work they had to do to bring those responsible for the journalist killing to justice, and full justice has yet to be achieved. In some cases, full justice doesn't seem to be achievable, at least at present. In Russia, for example, journalists Anna Politkovskaya and Natalia Istemirova worked on reporting for the Novaya Gazeta newspaper on human rights violations in the Caucasus. They both were murdered brutally, and those responsible for executing and masterminding the killings will likely walk free as long as Putin is in power in Russia. The other tool authorities use to silence journalists is imprisonment. Globally, at least 363 journalists are in jail for their work. 67 of them are women, so that's about 1/5 of the total number. And if we look at the top jailer of journalists, Iran, at least 62 journalists were behind bars on December 1st last year when we conducted our most recent prison census. and 24 of them are women. Since September, my colleagues working on Iran at CPJ have documented detentions of about 100 journalists, half of them are women, and these numbers are unprecedented. When Iran jailed a record high number of journalists following the 2009 contested presidential elections, out of 47 journalists in jail in 2012 that we documented, only 4 were women. And now you see the numbers, and I'm sure Yaira can speak more about Iran a bit later. Another country is Turkey, where at least 40 journalists are in jail, and among them is the world's longest imprisoned woman journalist, Hatice Duman. She's serving a life sentence since 2003. Hatice Duman was in her late 20s when she was imprisoned for her political views on fabricated charges. She is now 50 years old. We arranged a visit to prison to see her a couple of months ago. There is a retrial ongoing now in Turkey, but Hatice told us that she doesn't have any hope to be released. And unfortunately, nobody seems to have any interest in her case, not the judge, not the society, and it's a very tragic case, and that's why I wanted to highlight it today in my speech, because we're trying to draw attention to her plight. I won't go over all the countries, obviously, but I wanted to mention Belarus, which was the world's 5th largest jailer of journalists with 26 behind bars, because in Belarus, women played an important role in covering and reporting mass protests that erupted following the contested presidential elections of 2020. Dozens of women journalists and activists have been in jail. One of them I wanted to mention is Ksenia Lutskina. She's suffering from brain tumor, but is not getting any treatment she needs, and she has really bad headaches. And we're in touch with her family, and they don't know what can be done in her case because the authorities are not doing anything to help her. And another woman journalist imprisoned in Belarus I wanted to mention is Katerina Andreeva, who almost completed serving a 2-year sentence for reporting on protests, but then the authorities brought new charges against her. They accused her of treason and sentenced to another 8 years without a shred of evidence. There are other forms of harassment women journalists have been victims of: online smear campaigns, threats of death and physical violence. And interestingly, when a woman is threatened over her reporting, she is threatened not just for being a journalist, but also for being a woman. I mean, threats of sexual assault and such. And if she's a mother, she also usually receives threats about her children, which is not necessarily the case with men journalists who are fathers, parents. For example, last week we issued a statement about Slovakia, where radio host Marta Jančkárová received death threats through graphic messages sent by email and phone to her, threatening her and her family with physical and sexual assault and death. Police provided protection to the journalist that is investigating these threats. In all these forms of violations, the worst part is that the main violator of journalists' rights is usually their governments. Of course, there are cases when criminal groups or private individuals target journalists, and there are cases when women journalists are killed while reporting from war zones, as in Ukraine. In this case, it's a foreign government and foreign army that is responsible for the killing of most journalists that have been killed in Ukraine so far. But in many other cases, including murders and especially imprisonment, or legal cases and investigations launched against journalists and media outlets, or closure of media outlets, blocking of websites, DDoS attacks. In many of these cases in the region that I cover for CPJ, the main risk for journalists often comes from the authorities in the countries where these journalists live and work. So what do these journalists usually do? Many brave women journalists continue their work, often risking their lives, freedom, and well-being. Some decide to relocate temporarily to wait out on the threats or on online harassment. Many flee their home country fearing prosecution. For example, Ukrainian journalists had to flee the war when the full-scale invasion started last February, but many returned since then. In Russia, dozens of journalists fled fearing prosecution from their own government that have banned independent reporting on the war, as you know. And what do we at CPJ do to help these journalists? We provide financial and non-financial assistance with covering expenses for relocation or covering legal aid if journalists are facing investigations and such, or we help with prison support or medical support if journalists were injured or wounded while reporting or news gathering. We also have resources, extensive resources for journalists to stay safe physically and digitally. And also we help journalists get mental health support if they had a traumatic experience while working as journalists. All those resources and also information about how we can help can be found on our website, cpj.org. And of course, if there are any specific questions from the audience, I'll be happy to answer them. And also feel free to reach out to us through the website and social media accounts. I'll stop here, Stephanie. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Gulnoza. I think this is a very good overview to start the conversation. And also about questions, anybody in the audience, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to write them in the chat. I'll be monitoring it during the conversation, and I'll be happy to ask them at the end of our opening remarks. So Gulnoza, I think one thing that really comes out of what you said is this notion of impunity for crime against journalists. And it is very problematic in a lot of countries. And I do want to turn now to Iryna, because obviously, Iryna, the crisis in Ukraine, the invasion, the war, really has put a lot of reporters at risk. And you work for the Kyiv Independent. I think the Kyiv Independent has really stepped up, and it's been providing really crucial information about the war since the beginning. I've been following it pretty closely. It's still raging today, and can you just give us an idea of what it's been like for you to be covering this war, but also what you're hearing from your colleagues, your women reporters covering the war in Ukraine?
Yes, thank you for having me again. Yeah, so I've been in Ukraine throughout the whole period, and as you've already mentioned, I covered Russian aggression even before the full-scale invasion. So I was kind of like mentally in this coverage of war pretty much for 9 years. But of course, like the full-scale invasion was something very unexpected for everyone. And I personally didn't believe that it would happen on such scale. So when it happened, I was in Kyiv and I was working with NPR team as a local producer. I helped them prepare stories because they were anticipating big war, and I knew that like they needed some assistance from Ukrainian journalists who spoke English. So I decided to help, but I didn't really believe that full-scale war will happen on such scale. And when it happened, of course, it had like tremendous impact on any Ukrainian and even journalists. We were not prepared for this, psychologically speaking. So I remember the first day when I was working with NPR, so the war, I met the war in my window because I saw the explosion, distant explosion from my hotel room. And then I woke up my colleagues and I was in such panic that's like, I remember the first 2 hours, I just couldn't calm myself down. And my colleagues, male colleagues from NPR, they were trying like to help me out. But of course, I think it's not about being a woman, but just like being in your own country, knowing that like big war came and it will take, it will bring something horrible to all Ukrainians and your family probably too. So that's one aspect of being being a journalist covering war in your own country is something that I would not compare to working as a war reporter in foreign countries. It has a tremendous psychological toll on you, and we felt it throughout this year and up until now, even though it's been 1 year of the full-scale invasion. But covering all these horrible war crimes, being in this information space constantly, even despite what, like, regardless whether you're working or you're just like spending your free time, you're constantly in the same information pool. So all this negative news about war, they're always pressing on you. And like if we speak about being a female journalist during the war in Ukraine, I would say that I didn't personally feel any prejudice or some kind of bias against female journalists while covering the war. And that's something I can compare to the pre full-scale invasion period, because like there were maybe some issues were pushed on the background, and right now everyone feels kind of in the same boat, and we're all working on the same goal, and we know that everyone is doing something to cover this war, to make the world hear about this war and see what is happening. And maybe that's why like this gender equality became a bit better, because like there's a urgent need of coverage, any kind of coverage, and investigating war crimes, bringing the news to the world. And I don't have a statistics, but I think most of our journalists are female in Ukraine. And that's why they are huge. They constitute huge part of journalistic society in Ukraine, and their voices are seen and heard everywhere. Like either it's a foreign language information space or it's internal media coverage. Women are very present, and they are present at the front line. They are covering. They're doing some of the best reporting from the trenches. They are present in super dangerous zones, like in the actual battlefields. We also have, if we talk about women in general, we also have a lot of women fighting at the front line. So I would say that war kind of united male and female journalists in terms of what we can do and what we should do together. But of course, like gender issues are still present in Ukraine, and we see it, I would say the most vividly, we see it online when some, let's say, female journalists present something in a controversial way, or present some like facts that someone finds false. She can face more online harassment than a male journalist, and that's something that I see from time to time. And I'm also in this online group on Facebook where female journalists share experiences about their work, and I see that what they post, and they often mention this, that if you're a woman journalist, you will most probably face but more criticism than a man covering the war or covering Ukraine in general. So it's like, in real life, I didn't face any problems covering war crimes or humanitarian situation, whether it's in Kherson or Kyiv region, any kind of war zones. But at the same time, there is this bias from the society against women that sometimes extrapolates on female journalists, and they can face more criticism than male journalists. Maybe you can ask some following questions so that I can continue.
Yes, well, I think for now we'll turn to Myra, but I'll definitely come back to you, Iryna, during the Q&A question, because I do want to follow up on a lot of things that you said. But Myra, Iran is also a country that's made the headlines a lot recently. I mean, it's been months, and women are still protesting for basic rights in the country, and you've been covering this closely. So what can you tell us, Myra, about best practices when it comes to covering this issue in Iran?
Sure, thank you for the opportunity. First, I want to do a comparison here. In Ukraine case, it's a foreign country that has invaded Ukraine. In Iran case, is the Islamic Republic, the government that invaded Iran in 1979 and have occupied the country and took 80+ million hostages ever since. Today, I want to tell the story of my people focusing on women who have been one of the first targets of the Islamic regime in Iran since its formation, as well as Christians, Baha'is, Jews, and others. As we all know, freedom of expression drives all other human rights. When there is no freedom of expression, there is no human rights. Under the Islamic Republic's rule, Iran is the third biggest prison for journalists. According to RSF's 2022 World Press Freedom Index, Iran remains one of the world's worst press freedom rankings at 178 out of 180 countries. At least 1,000 journalists and citizen journalists have been arrested, imprisoned, disappeared, murdered, or executed by the regime since 1979. According to Reporters Without Borders, 8 journalists have been detained since the beginning of 2023 alone. The Tehran Journalist Association reported that since the spark of the nationwide revolutionary movement in September, the regime arrested nearly 70 journalists, some of whom have been released on bail awaiting sentencing. At the same time, at least 30 others are still in detention. Among them are Niloufar Hamedi and Elahe Mohammadi, 2 reporters in jail for reporting the truth about the death of Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old girl that was killed in police custody. It's because of them that we know what happened to Mahsa. As always, the regime incriminates the dissidents with false accusations like threatening national security, inciting public opinion, and conspiring with the enemies. The exact number of prisoners linked to the media activities, however, is much higher. The lack of press freedom has prompted citizens to take on this crucial role. As smartphones, social networks, and the digital world have revolutionized the way of journalism and news delivery, especially in countries like Iran that violate press freedom, citizen journalists have informed us about the brutality of the regime. Many of them, of course, are arrested, imprisoned, tortured, and some blinded. Among countless victims, Ghazaleh Chalabi, a 33-year-old woman, was shot dead by the forces on September 30th while she was recording protests on Amol Street, a city in North Iran. The video was shared on social media shortly after her death. Only moments before forces shot her, in the video, we see that Ghazaleh shouting, "Don't be afraid, don't be afraid, we are all together." Also, bloggers and social media activists have been the regime's target, like Arsa Mahmoudi, although he is a man who was arrested during the recent revolutionary uprising and he is still imprisoned. Therefore, I want to draw the attention of organizations and bodies that work for freedom of press, freedom of expression, to anonymous citizen journalists, those who have reported the most authentic news by risking their lives to make their cry for freedom heard. In the massacre of November 2018, when the government shut down the internet for 3 days and murdered more than 1,500 innocents, these very citizen journalists put their lives in their hands, made up for the lack of independent media, and warned the world about the massive murder and repression. Information is a public good was the slogan of the United Nations on Press Freedom Day in 2021. The wealth that Islamic Republic has looted from Iranians for over 40 years. From the first day of the formation of the Islamic regime in Iran, information has been taken hostage. Media has been used as a government propaganda tool, from encouraging 9-year-old girls to get married to broadcasting forced confessions to frighten society. Shockingly, the Biden administration waived sanctions on Iran's state-run news arm last month. Even while the regime uses the outlet to distort and underreport its murder of dissidents and fuel sham trials against protesters. As one of the most prominent government-controlled media aligned with IRIB, I want to name Fars News Agency affiliated with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, known as IRGC. The falsification of reality is not only limited to the country's borders and the regime itself through infiltrating its agents into Western media in the face of journalists. The Islamic Republic for years has invested in influencing the public opinions of Western countries and politicians, spreading its propaganda, expanding its radical ideology, and manipulating the information only to remain in power. Unfortunately, women have been part of this propaganda. For instance, during the widespread protests in November 2019 that I mentioned earlier, some of the regime's mouthpieces in free Western media condemned the US sanction as the cause of economic chaos in Iran and consequently the protest, while Iranians inside the country were chanting, "Our enemy is right here. They lie that it is America." The same journalists blamed the United States president when IRGC's missiles shot down the Ukrainian flight known as flight number 752, once again echoing the voice of the Islamic Republic's leader, Ali Khamenei. Yes, Iranian women have suffered not only from the government, but also from the whitewashers who write for the bloodthirsty regime in Western newspapers to make the regime's face look decent on the global stage. And I repeat that unfortunately, an essential part of these journalists who justify the regime's crimes are women. And it doesn't end here. While school kids were under chemical attacks, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights met the regime's representative, Hossein Amir Abdollahian, shaking his hand in Geneva. Moreover, the Belgian foreign minister, who previously cut her hair to show solidarity with Iranian women, met with oppressors' same representative, Hossein Amir Abdollahian, the regime's foreign minister, during UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, leaving the Iranian women behind. Iranians say the double standard of many Western politicians, and in some cases, unfortunately, human rights organizations, are standing in our way to freedom instead of helping us. The courageous people who have taken to the streets, unarmed, hopeful, shoulder to shoulder, men and women, and they have kept coming back. While we might think the regime has already used all possible ways of oppression, yet they always come up with something even crueler. As we celebrate International Women's Day, schools and metro stations are targets of a mysterious chemical attack. The attacks were initiated by girls' school and spread to some boys' schools and metro stations. Let's stand alongside the freedom lover Iranians. Go beyond slogans and supportive words and show our solidarity with action. Here, I would like to share a few steps about how to amplify their voices. First, you can educate local and national policymakers about the ongoing events and issues and how they can support them by listening closely to their demands through reliable channels and individuals. Use your platforms and share news from Iran and raise awareness. Support citizen journalists by sharing their content, their footage, and spreading the word. Stay involved by attending rallies around the world. Call your representatives and ask them to take a firmer stand against the regime. Ask your representatives to support the Mahsa Amini Act. This bipartisan sanction bill aims to impose sanctions on high-level regime officials in response to the killing of Mahsa Amini and the crackdown on protesters. Be sensitive to whom you give voice to, the regime agents or the people of Iran. Say the names of those in prison. Let us remember Fatemeh Sepehri, an outspoken critic of the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. She has been sentenced to 18 years imprisonment after calling on him to resign peacefully. And how here I want to mention some steps that policymakers and politicians can take to support men and women of Iran. Sanction on Iran's state-run news arm, IRIB. Block all the channels of transactions done by IRGC and related affiliates. List IRGC as a terrorist organization. Declare an end to Iran nuclear deal known as JCPOA. And sanction Ali Khamenei, who is responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths, arrests, executions, rapes, tortures, and so on. Encourage and facilitate creating of a labor strike fund to support the movement as those who want to go on a strike. Democracy cannot function without a free and independent flow of information. Under the rule of the Islamic Republic, neither the free flow of information is possible, nor is democracy an achievable dream for Iranians. Therefore, to help this problem and eliminate the repression, the international community must stop the notion that Iran's repressive regime could be reformed or even change its behavior. Instead, listen to the wish of the Iranian people fighting the fight on their own. Support their cause to take control of their own destiny and future, and stop dealing, appeasing, and negotiating with the representatives of the bloodthirsty regime. The free world should talk to the freedom-loving people of Iran and the opposition abroad, people who have shared values with you. They want democracy, equality, liberty, and their basic civil rights. A world without the Islamic Republic, with a free Iran, will be safer for everyone, including women. And ultimately, I would like to quote a part of Prince Reza Pahlavi's message on International Women's Day. During the dark 44-year period of this regime's occupation of Iran, Iranian women have fought bravely for their rights, and today they are at the forefront of the historic revolutionary movement. They will prevail with unwavering support from their fathers, sons, and brothers. Iranians will reclaim Iran from this regime and author a future in which women will live freely with equality alongside men. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mara. And now, last but not least, I want to turn to Marina. Marina, the situation in Brazil, is very different from the situation, let's say, in Ukraine or in Iran. That being said, it hasn't been a quiet year when it comes to especially Brazilian politics. Now, can you tell us what it's been like to be a woman covering, the most recent presidential elections and the events that followed?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much again. So I have been a journalist for 16 years, and I was the US correspondent for one of the largest newspapers in Brazil. But most of my career, I was covering politics and other issues in Brazil. And the fact is, I have never been so attacked as I have been in the last 4 years. There were online attacks, in-person attacks by the former president, Jair Bolsonaro, verbally. But my most recent experience was the peak. It was on January 8th in Brasilia, the capital of my country. I was there covering the riots by former President Jair Bolsonaro's supporter. As you know, Bolsonaro is a right-wing populist who has always encouraged attacks against the press and journalists. So then I was there doing my job, and out of the blue, I was surrounded by more than 10 people who knocked me on the ground, kicked me, beat me, pulled my hair, broke my glasses, tried to take my cell phone. And at some point, someone yelled at me, "We need to kill her." So it's so much hate, And they did that when they discovered that I was a reporter asking questions to a lady who had agreed to answer all of them. So I was attacked just because I was a reporter, because I am a reporter and I was doing my job. Professional journalism has always annoyed public authorities in Brazil and all over because we challenge them and we investigate what they are doing. But since the end of the military dictatorship in Brazil in 1985, we had never seen the kind of institutionalized violence against the press that we saw during the 4 years of the Bolsonaro government. So attacks on professional journalism are a method and a public policy for leaders like Donald Trump in the US and like Jair Bolsonaro, who always said that he was inspired by his American buddy, Trump. So it's the way they act to undermine democracy and accountability. We know that, but we cannot normalize that. So there was no formal censorship under Bolsonaro government in Brazil, as there was during the dictatorship here, for example. But attacks on the press were systemic under Bolsonaro. And he, as a president, was encouraging policies to cut money from outlets, with speeches urging people to stop subscribing to newspapers and magazines, asking advisors to stop advertising in the professional media. And Bolsonaro, as a president, he was unsubscribing from newspapers in public buildings in Brasilia, for example. So the government in Brazil under Bolsonaro used the institutions to persecute media outlets and reduce their ability to report, to do critical reporting. Bolsonaro and his allies also attacked women journalists directly, like me and a lot of my colleagues and friends, calling us names and demeaning us simply for asking basic questions about his government. With this, Bolsonaro legitimized violence against women journalists. And as the country's highest authority, he fed his supporters with fake news and hate. And it was what motivated the 10 or more people that beat me on January 8th. I have no doubt. But what amazed me that day was that the behavior of several women there who were there scratching me, calling me a whore, a slut, and they were throwing bottles of water at my head. So this appeal to gender, a lot of times misogyny, is not by coincidence. In societies with a massive presence of conservative values like Brazil, this type of attack serves to undermine the work of women who, in their views, should not be questioning the president. So it happened to me, but also to brilliant journalists like Daniela Lima, host of CNN Brazil, and Patricia Campos Melo, reporter at Folha de São Paulo. But as we know, it's not personal. It's not about me. It's not about Daniela. It's not about Patricia. It's a method. Yeah, and I have numbers about Brazil. A report by ABRAGE, the Brazilian Association of Investigative Journalists with UNESCO, showed that female journalists suffer one attack every 3 days in Brazil in 2021, so under Bolsonaro. And Bolsonaro was one of the main aggressors. And during his government that year, 2021, there was a 79% increase in the number of attacks against women journalists or gender bias. So overall, there were 119 cases reported. More than half of the aggressors, 52%, were public officials, including Bolsonaro. 95% were men. 68% of the attacks started online, and 60% of the cases involved journalists in the politics coverage. So these numbers reflect in Brazil what we see in many other places in the globe, as this panel has discussed it. Again, it's not a coincidence. It's a method set up and well paid on social networks. In Brazil, even with evidence of the use of public money when Bolsonaro was president. So according to this great American author, Barbara Walter, to overcome this system of destruction of democracy from inside, as Bolsonaro does, it is necessary at least two pillars. One is free elections, which we have in Brazil, despite these false allegations of fraud spread by Bolsonaro and his supporters. And two, efficient and effective public services. So yes, I believe that democratic and popular governments make the free press stronger. And our job as journalists is to put a spotlight on what we are seeing as important and relevant. But sometimes we're tired, yeah? But we need to keep the good work with good info, good analysis, but also we need to expect that someone else will do something too. The state, the society, and sometimes when nobody reacts, we get frustrated. But it's important to keep in mind that these attacks that we are talking about here are not just attacks on the press, attacks on journalists. They are attempts to undermine journalism and to stop critical reporting. They are part of these leaders' efforts to escape accountability and to limit public response to their anti-democratic acts. So criticism of our work is good for free society, of course, and I think we all can deal with that. But those attacks that Bolsonaro in Brazil and similar leaders around the globe have done are attacks on democracy itself. And again, we cannot naturalize that. Keeping our work as journalists is the way to fight against this method. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marina, and thank you for trying to end on a positive note and for keeping going, because these are pretty, I'm sure, these were pretty difficult situations to deal with in your daily life and in your daily work. So we'll definitely come back to you, but I do want to open the floor to questions now. So anybody who has any question, feel free to enter them in the chat. And we already have one from Roger, and I do want to, from Roger, so I'll go back with Iryna. So Iryna, the question is, when you have time, can you elaborate on the psychological effect of covering war in your own country as opposed to being a foreign correspondent?
Yes. Well, I slightly touched upon that, but I guess maybe it's not that obvious for to anyone who didn't go through war, of course. Well, first of all, with this kind of full-scale war, you immediately worry for all your relatives, your loved ones. And when the war started, I was in Kyiv and my family was in Lviv, but I knew that missiles were hitting all over the country. So I was evacuating with an American team for about 3 days, and it took me 3 days to get home, while it usually takes like 5-7 hours. And I was very worried, like, for what was happening there, because I didn't know, even though like Western Ukraine is close to Poland, so it's supposed to be safer there. But at that time, like, everything looked horrible. And I was stressed for myself because I didn't know where I was going. Like the evacuation was pretty messy, and we were just like driving away from the popular route. And that's why it took us 3 days to get to Western Ukraine. So I was worried not to get trapped in some kind of like situation where Russian troops would come closer, would come further into the country, since we were driving more into central Ukraine. And at the same time, I was worried for my parents, who were not much in the topic. And for them, the full-scale war was a complete surprise. And actually, when I arrived home, I saw that they like probably psychologically couldn't accept what was happening, because at that time we had a rule that everyone had to turn off all the lights so that like Russian planes would not see cities and villages from above. And my parents didn't understand that, so I was like in panic, turning all the lights when I came. I think many people just blocked this kind of negative, like this amount of shocking news, and they couldn't accept that what was really happening. At the same time, I was in a kind of privileged, I would say, situation as a woman in Ukraine, in terms of that I didn't have my own family, I didn't have children to evacuate. And that's another issue that I forgot to mention when I was speaking about discrimination of female journalists in Ukraine. I think war itself is a super discriminatory thing already, because if like there were a lot of female journalists who had children, and they had to make a choice. When the war started, the full-scale war started, they had to make a choice whether they are staying to report. And for many of them, it was a predominant choice because they felt it was their duty. But at the same time, they had to compromise safety of their children, and they had to take care of their children because men were not allowed to leave the country. So all the responsibility lied on the shoulders of women. And I know that many female journalists evacuated from Ukraine, but they came back, and some of them had to make a choice to leave their children to someone and go back alone, or they stayed while reporting and at the same time dealing with a lot of refugee issues, looking for housing, looking for opportunities to work, since it was not enough to work only for Ukrainian media. It was a lot of challenges. And but as I've said already, war is a super discriminatory situation. And for women, it's even more difficult because we are not safe anywhere completely. But if you're a woman and you end up in an occupied city, let's say, and if you're a journalist, moreover, it's a super dangerous situation. And as we could see from war crimes reports, women are even more vulnerable to sexual violence, except for other things like torture and humiliation that can happen. And that's why, of course, this discrimination exists on different levels, and women are, any woman, not only a journalist, is vulnerable to that. But in terms of psychological toll, there's a lot of things to think about. It's your own safety, it's your family, it's your own country. These people that you see on pictures and videos that are shown all around the world, that it could be you shot on the streets with your kids. That kindergarten or school that was bombed, or the neighborhood that was hit by a missile, and you kind of associate yourself and affiliate more to what you see. And each time we see these war crimes, we take it personally. And recently there was this horrible video just this week of Russian soldiers shooting Ukrainian prisoner of war. And I saw this video because it didn't blur, and maybe I didn't even want to see it, but I saw it. And when he shot the POW, my heart almost stopped, because I know that if I was there, if I said glory to Ukraine or something like this, I would be shot too. So it's a different level of affiliation and attachment, I think, than when you report on other conflicts.
Thank you, Iryna. Now I want to go back.
If I may add something about Ukraine, the need for psychological support is one of the biggest needs now, probably second to physical safety of journalists covering the war. And it's interesting how, from where I stand at CPJ, we also obviously cooperate with a lot of other press freedom and media organizations. And I've seen the evolution of the needs since the full-scale invasion started on February 24th last year. And at the initial stages, it was the need for personal protective equipment for journalists who wanted to go to the war zone and cover the conflict. And also there was a need for a lot of information from how to get insurance and how to get to the country to, immediate questions like, is this road safe? Is that area accessible? How do we get accreditation? Do we need accreditation? And that sort of thing. So we were working with a lot of journalists. And if you noticed, practically all journalists who were killed in the full-scale invasion were killed in the first few months of the conflict last year. Although the incidents when the journalists are injured or escape some violence continue, but the killings happened in Kyiv and surrounding areas when the situation was very dangerous and very precarious. But as the war continues, there is more and more need for psychological support, especially from local journalists, Ukrainian journalists who are like Iryna, who are there, who have been there for more than 12 months now. And the good thing about the Ukrainian society is that they have a strong civil society with developed press freedom and media organizations and journalist associations. So they started looking for ways to help those journalists. And there is a hotline, there are experts like psychologists and counselors who can help journalists. And I'm glad to see that there is more awareness among journalists themselves, and they started talking. And I think women are leaders in this because they're more aware of this need comparing to men. And it's definitely a positive thing that they are aware of this need, and they talk about their need for help. But unfortunately, the help that is offered cannot cover the demand. So one of the things that organizations like CPJ and many others who work on Ukraine are trying to do is to work on providing psychological help to journalists in Ukraine.
Iryna, I think you had something to add on this.
Just wanted to add that it's true. Journalists are aware of that they need psychological help, and it's kind of a good thing that now people talk about it openly. It's not a taboo anymore. It's a bad thing that it happened because of the full-scale war, but at the same time, before the full-scale invasion, such topics as psychological help were not perceived well on a level of massive society, So now it's totally okay to say that you need, and I see some journalists are tweeting or like writing about it, that they are taking breaks, that they're going through counseling, and I even went through counseling in summer. But also like an interesting thing that I noticed among female journalists, there is this group on Facebook that I mentioned already, and since the war began, they organized online meetings. It was called something like female psychological support. So they just gathered informally to talk about certain issues, like to help each other, to support, like informally, besides covering the war. They were sharing their experiences and helping each other to go through this. So I think it's also a positive thing.
Thank you, Iryna. And maybe turning to Marina, I mean, what happened to you during your coverage was also something that must be pretty traumatizing, or at least something pretty shocking. Did you feel like you had enough resources psychologically, or do you think in Brazil in general, there's enough resources to protect reporters facing these type of threats and harassment?
Yes, thank you for the question. Yeah, it was a trauma, but like at that moment, I was not feeling like myself. I cannot explain, because it was like, you never expect that. Like, we know how to cover protests, but like protests by those supporters, by Bolsonaro supporters, they are not regular protests. They are riots, they are violent, they are full of hate, and they hate you journalists, So when I was there, I was not feeling like myself. I thought I was like in a movie. It was like, I was like looking at me out of the scene. I don't know how to explain, but it was a trauma process. And then I was having like nightmares, but we need to work. Yeah, we need to report what happened, and so the world can hear about Brazil, can hear about what happened there. It was not normal. It was not a regular protest, as I said. But here we have in Brazil, we have a lot of sources and a lot of resources and tools to protect journalists, which is really good. We have like associations. We have good protections, like even from the newsroom. But again, it's new from us. Yeah, it's new to us. I didn't live during the dictatorship in Brazil, so I don't know how it was, but I know how it was because I read about it. And Brazilian people, they usually forgot. They don't like to talk about the past. And this is a problem because we cannot forget. You know, that's why we are reporting here. That's why we are like looking the history closely. And that's it. So I think we have the tools in Brazil to protect journalists, which is good, but it's not enough because something new is happening. This right wing, it's new to us, and we don't know yet how to deal with them. So when a journalist is beat on the street because usually she was working, it's something that after the dictatorship we've never seen, and now we are, you know. So I think we are learning. We are learning in an ongoing process.
Gulnoza, did you have anything to add on this? I see you have your hand up.
No, I think I raised it when Iryna was speaking.
All right, thank you. Maybe turning back to Iryna. So your bio says the nature of your work is, you know, writing analysis about Russian propaganda and narratives. And I think what we've seen in Ukraine is, you know, it's really an information war as much as it's a war in the field. So can you tell us a little bit about that type of reporting that you're doing and the challenges?
Well, I'm doing a lot of different things, but right now I'm a video reporter, and like till the end of last year, I was covering war crimes mostly. But this year we started with history debunking, debunking historical misconceptions project, and also I'm doing like analytical videos on things that I see come from Russian propaganda into different countries, you know. So I'm pretty much monitoring the narratives, the pro-Kremlin narratives, and covering it according to the news and what is going on in Europe and the US. It's nothing new, actually. It's just like it's aggravated with the full-scale invasion. I've been monitoring Russian propaganda since the war started in 2014, and even earlier when Maidan revolution happened. That's when all the shift started with Ukraine and Russia, and that's actually where the narratives about Ukrainians being Nazi and Russians being rescuers of the world come from, like from Euromaidan revolutions, because Russian propaganda says that it was a coup. And that's when the annexation of Crimea started, then the war in the East, and all this propaganda has been in place for 9 years, but not like most of the world didn't see it. I was working in this project called Ukraine World, and I was writing articles on different topics related to the war and Russian propaganda. And I remember it was a real struggle to make people read about Ukraine. Of course, there were experts and people interested in Eastern Europe and Russia who were following the topic, but the majority of opinion makers, leaders, were not giving much attention to the propaganda war and hybrid warfare that was happening in this region and against Ukraine. And we knew that it would lead to escalation because we saw the fascist regime developing in Russia. We saw how this rhetoric, hateful rhetoric against Ukraine was growing. It was turning into genocidal language, and that's eventually what it led to. That's why in January and February, we started to see open calls for genocide against Ukrainians. And I know that in the international community, it's not a widespread term to say it's genocidal war, but there are several reasons. There are several things that are happening in Ukraine that prove that it's a genocidal war, except for propaganda, the language that is calling to kill people based on their political affiliation. Like basically they are saying that Russia should destroy Ukraine as a nation, and anyone who considers himself Ukrainian is considered a nationalist and so has to be killed. Except these things, they are deporting children to Russia. They are re-educating children. It's like a very thought through process. So like over 16,000 children were already deported, and some of them are already sent to new families and going through some kind of Russification. And these things have been ongoing, and I'm working on that because I know the implications. I know that what exactly this propaganda and hybrid, like this propaganda that came from hybrid warfare, can lead to. And I see direct correlation of war crimes that are being committed by Russian soldiers in Ukraine. I see the correlation with this genocidal language.
Thank you, Iryna. Now I want to turn to Myra before we finish. So you've been amplifying, as you said, the voice of the voiceless in Iran. Can you tell us, give some advice on how other reporters can also help, raising women in Iran's voices?
Sure. Before that, let me mention the really horrible statistics about sexual harassment on Iranian female journalists as 90%. 90%. It's horrible. Among all other discriminations and difficulties they face to just do their job, we see these horrible statistics. And among the abusers, 36% of them are either governmental or non-governmental officials. To answer your question, it's just raising awareness and constantly talking about it. Like now we have the chemical attacks on schoolgirls. It started in schoolgirls on the girls' school, but it is spreading to also other schools, boys' schools, metro stations. We had footage, and this footage coming out of the country, they're really valuable. People have put their lives in their hands to, just send out, get the news out, even though if it is couple seconds, that's how they could inform the world about what is happening in Iran. If there wasn't those citizen journalists, we wouldn't know that, how many lives were taken, were raped, were blinded, and the scale of the oppression. We would not know if there wasn't sharing all these videos that are coming out. Don't think that it's just a video. No, it is valuable. So I want to ask you, every one of you, to use your platforms, whatever platform you have, your social media, and just share them, spread the word, raise awareness, and don't let this go down, and keep attract the attention to what the Iranian women and men are fighting for their freedom, like Ukrainians are doing. You know what? We have Iranians and Ukrainians have the same enemies. The Islamic regime, the Russia, they are the same evil. As they are united, we need to be united for a free world as well.
Thank you, Myra. So we have about 10 minutes left to the panel. Okay, so Iryna, I see that you want to add something, and maybe just in general, I do want to give you all a platform maybe for some concluding remarks. So I guess we can start with Iryna, and then, if you have some, Iryna, if you want to share what you wanted to share, but also some concluding thoughts.
I just wanted to follow Myra on Iran. Ukrainian people, despite all the things that we are going through ourselves, we are following, we try to follow what is happening in the world. And Ukrainians were really supportive of Iranians against the regime. fighting against the regime. We really have the same enemy, and I don't know if it's a known fact, but Iranian-made drones that Iranian regime is sending to Russia are actually hitting our cities and destroying houses, infrastructure, killing people as well. So this is really like a very physical threat, and we like that's why not only because of that, but also because of that, Ukrainians are really supportive of Iranian people, and we really feel what is happening there, and feel especially sorry for all the women being vulnerable to violence of the Iranian regime.
Yeah, what is so beautiful, if I may say this, in the worldwide rallies that has been held by Iranians, Ukrainians have joined, and when Ukrainians held rallies and demonstrations, Iranian joined, and they have been standing alongside each other, shoulder to shoulder, for the same cause, I guess.
Yeah, and we've seen a lot of solidarities between Iranian and Afghan women as well, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So Gulnoza, maybe if you have some final remarks, and I know that there's a question for Mehmet as well about how reporters are dealing with the psychological trauma and services that are available. So if any of you also want to incorporate some of that in your final remarks, but Gulnoza, I want to give you the floor one last time.
Yes, thank you, Stephanie. And Iryna mentioned a very interesting thing about Ukraine, Ukrainian journalism being mostly female. And if you look at North America or Western Europe, it's mostly men. You see in newsrooms, especially in leadership positions. But when you move eastward, in my region, in the region I cover for CPJ, at least in many countries in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, in the post-Soviet space, journalism has a female face. It's mostly women who report. And by supporting journalism and press freedom, we are supporting women and vice versa. So it's very important to keep that in mind. It's the women journalists who bring important news, who help us stay informed and make decisions about Ukraine or Iran or any other country around the world. So they deserve all the support, and we at CPJ are happy to continue supporting them and assisting them. I don't know if other journalists want to answer that question about psychological trauma, because we are the ones working in the field.
Iryna, I think you had something to say about it.
Just wanted also to add that the Kyiv Independent is ruled by women. By young women, and most of our journalists are female as well. And you know, it's a very young media because it was founded during like a few months before the full-scale invasion. So, but during this year it became like a dominant source of information from Ukraine for the outer world, which is also proves that females are leading journalism in Ukraine. But about the trauma on the field, well, from my experience, I don't know how it works, but when I was interviewing people who went through like violence and like Russian bombardment, who went through terrible things, who lost their loved ones in attacks, I knew I was covering terrible things. But somehow my brain was blocking the information that was coming, probably like it was a psychological protective reaction. So at that moment, like on the field, I felt much better. Also, maybe because I was working on adrenaline, because you care about your security, you hear some kind of explosions sometimes, and you have this kind of self-protective reaction, and maybe you don't react too much on what other people say. But when you come back home and you start to process all this and you start to work on the information, that's when it starts to hit. Like when I reported, like, for example, a story about torture in Kherson, or how Russians shot two young men in a village in Kherson Oblast, I literally had disruptions in sleep. I was thinking repeatedly about those families, like what they were going through, only weeks after I went there. So I guess like the psychological toll increases after you come back from the front line. It doesn't disappear, like it's the opposite.
Yeah, and your reaction on the spot seems to echo a little bit what Marina shared about her experience as well.
Yeah.
Marina, did you have any concluding thought on our topic?
No, I just want to thank you and like hear those women that are doing this amazing job all around the world. Like that's why I want to keep working, you know, like how you treat your trauma, your psychological. Sometimes I don't, and I know I'm wrong. Like sometimes I just kept like hidden from me, you know, and like see you working and reporting all of this give me like make me stronger to like I have to go, I need to keep the work. And I think that's it, being among like those powerful women is really good for journalists like us doing this job. And that's it. It's a lot of times it's a trauma, a lot of times we don't take care of it, and again it's wrong, but doing our work it's a way to fight against everything. So thank you.
Thank you, Marina. And Myra, I'll give you the floor. We have a few minutes left.
All right, well, thank you. I want to thank you for this opportunity to talk about what Iranians, specifically Iranian women, are fighting for, and just to encourage everyone that is fighting for freedom, just keep fighting, and us in the free world, let's just support them, not only by our words, but by our actions, and keeping our representatives, the politicians, the policymakers aware of what is happening, and asking them to support, in my case, Iranians' demands, which is freedom, which is getting rid of this child killing regime, and to establish their future with a free Iran. Just keep fighting.
Thank you so much, Iryna. Yes.
I just want to add a final comment, because I think I didn't answer how I'm dealing with psychological trauma, and like wanted to conclude that despite what we have to cover, and I know that often journalists feel this duty to be there to report, even though you might not feel well, or you might be busy with a lot of different things, but it's very important to take care of your health. And throughout this year, I really understood when I need to take a break, and when it's like essential to take care of yourself, like to have a break. Like the world will not fall without you. It definitely will be better, but it's very important to care for ourselves and then do important things.
Thank you, Iryna. And yes, please do take care of yourself. And thank you so much to all our panelists today, whether it's through your reporting or Gulnoza, through the help that you're providing for reporters. You're all doing amazing work. And I see in the chat also that, you know, a lot of people do appreciate everything you've shared and your courage. So thank you. Thank you to everyone who also watched the panel, and to the foundation for organizing the event.